Bruh. Hi.
Hello.
Welcome to the Footnotes podcast, where we share the footnotes of our week. We're back after a week of taking a break. We were applying for a radio show, trying to broaden our reach a little bit. We'll see how that goes. But yeah, we're back at it. This is Thanksgiving weekend, and I'm back at home in Mississauga. June's still in Hamilton, but going back tomorrow.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving. Happy Canadian Thanksgiving.
That's
Um, to our
right.
American listeners, we'll be back with you next month. Yeah, cool. Like we have American listeners. Um, June, what's been going on, man? It's been 2 weeks. Lots to catch up on, eh?
Yeah, lots to catch up on, but it might have been my carb-heavy brunch from this morning,
Uh
but I remember very little from the past 2 weeks.
huh. Me too.
It seems like a blur.
Yeah.
I don't remember any significant events.
I just had a end of block exam
Uh,
like this past Friday.
yeah.
And so I've forgotten everything before that. It's so traumatic. Um, but yeah,
How did that go?
it was good. I did want to talk about education a little bit because
Yeah.
I tweeted saying the exam is like a 1 rep max in the gym. It's like you try to memorize as much as you can and then you perform it and then you're done. And it really means very little in terms of how strong you are. So I think there's some problems there with the classic education system that is tailored towards doing well in tests and things like that. So I know you personally and at Mac don't have that similar structure.
Mhm.
And I wanted to actually get a sense of like what you guys are doing as well, because now you've had a month to get into the swing of things and figure things out. So my at University of Western Ontario, the structure is pretty much similar to your traditional undergrad course where you learn content through lecture. There's some small group stuff, some experiential learning, sure, but then you have an exam at the end of the block and end of the semester to test your knowledge. But do you want to go ahead and talk about maybe MacMed and the unique structure that they have?
Yeah, I don't know if I can be the best advocate for the McMaster model.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I mean that in the sense that I don't know how well trained I am to explain it. Not that I
Okay.
don't like it, uh,
Okay.
but to my understanding, McMaster is all about problem-based learning. So
Mm-hmm.
in something called tutorial, which is essentially a group of 8 medical students plus one tutor, so a practicing doctor who is there to reside as
Mm-hmm.
acting as a facilitator and offering their experience and knowledge. In that group structure, we explore a case or two every week.
Mm-hmm.
It's blocked into different subjects. So the subject that we're delving into, well, that we've delved into for the past month is respirology.
Mm-hmm.
And so each case presents itself with like a different pathology or different problem. And the idea is that the group will autonomously generate kind of learning objectives for themselves that they want to find out to better help understand the case of the patient.
Mm-hmm.
And so far, I've really enjoyed that model. So that includes kind of discussing together with your group what the most essential learning components are, and if you go astray a little bit, then our tutors are there to set us on the right track in
Mm-hmm.
terms of, hey, I think you guys should, really understand the anatomy of the lungs a little bit more, or the trachea, or whatever. So there's this, yeah, kind of self driving system that we have at Mac, and I
Right.
love the kind of flexibility and freedom that comes from that. And then we have our more didactic elements too. So we have lectures, which I don't attend for later. Um,
Okay.
the chief reason being laziness.
Oh, okay.
Simply. There we have lectures, we have clinical skill sessions where we get together the same tutorial group with 2 residents who help us learn and practice our clinical skills. So we're doing respiratory exams now. We're practicing those. And first we did vital signs, and the idea is that as we explore more cases and problems and learn, we'll develop a sufficient understanding of, I don't know, the human to enter clerkship. So that's kind of the McMaster problem-based model. A lot of group self-directed work that's facilitated by an experienced tutor, plus some didactic elements like lectures and anatomy labs.
Well, now that you've fleshed out the McMaster way of teaching, I feel like I have the responsibility of advocating for the Western style of teaching, just because I feel bad, but just saying, it's a traditional style learning. We also have a lot of those components. Actually, we have a small group session.
Yeah.
But we talk about issues like euthanasia or medically assistance in dying. We talk about prenatal screening and abortion associated with that. At least currently, I think we're switching topics in the next block or next unit, which is going to be blood. Our first unit was called Intro to Medicine, and it talked about a variety of topics that are sort of non-related, but are considered basics for medicine, and so they just sort of fit everything in there in 1 month. We also have those clinical skills as well. Our first month has been more about it's sort of like a family med clinical skills in the sense that we don't do any physical exams yet. We just do basically gathering information, gathering data to make a clinical diagnosis. And then we have lectures every morning, 8:30. And I'll be honest, well, I've skipped a few. I haven't skipped all of them. They're podcasted, which really incentivizes students to skip these lectures, ironically. And so, yeah. What I wanted to talk about was essentially, are these forms of education actually preparing us to be good doctors? And from my 1 month experience, I want to say no. I'm learning facts, I'm learning information, but again, it feels like undergrad again, where I'm learning this just for an exam. I pass the exam, and then where that knowledge goes in my brain, I don't know. It's sort of some of it disappears, some of it remains somewhere in the recesses of my mind. Some stuff I remember by heart, but it's very strange. I don't know if I'm retaining enough information to be actually a competent physician. And I'm wondering if your experience is similar or different in any way.
I mean, I've thought about the way I learn a lot. So even before starting medical school and during, I've been meeting up with an upper year mentor of mine to kind of discuss how to learn best, so that, so it's nice at McMaster that we don't have the pressure of summative exams or exams whose grades are of consequence to your graduation, let's say, of any real consequence. It's very difficult to fail MacMed. So we enjoy the freedom of that, and what that gives me is kind of the flexibility to learn really to become a good clerk. But I think the goal of pre-clerkship, which is the first 2 years in your case, or 1.5 year in my case of medical education, the goal of pre-clerkship is to prepare you to be a good clerk. That's why it's called pre-clerkship. And as a clerk, you're exposed to all the major disciplines of modern Western medicine. And you're gonna need to have a common set of clinical skills, of communication skills, and general, responsibility to perform that task well. Because for those 2 years that you're in clerkship, you're a very important part of the Canadian healthcare system. You're not just there to learn. You're there also to supply your labor and try to apply your education.
Right.
So I've been thinking about like what are the qualities that would make me a good clerk? And as I'm discussing with Dave, my mentor, like we very quickly come to the conclusion where he helps me see that the nitty-gritty details of like the mechanisms and the cellular molecular biology, like those are really cool. And in certain circumstances, those will be very crucial and very critical. But in most of the scenarios that you'll encounter in clerkship, it's not going to be important, or in clinical settings. So, some of the more important things are things like the patient's symptoms and their story. And so something interesting that my tutor, Dr. Perfetto, he's a family medicine, he's a family doctor, and he's also involved in pedagogy at Mac. He said that 90% of the information you need to know, you'll learn from the story right away. So he gave an example of, so if I tell you that there's a 65-year-old man who has a 40-year history of 2-pack a day smoking, and he's coming in breathless, what do you think he has? And like 90% of the time, your mind is going to go to COPD, and 90% of the time, that's going to be right. So a lot of medicine is about like kind of seeing the whole picture from the patient that walks in, like the symptoms they present with, their background, their story, their history, and kind of taking that and then going to the next step of, all right, what is the diagnosis? Then to the next step of what tests can confirm or deny that, and then if the diagnosis is there, then what are the treatment strategies available? And that's kind of how what like most of modern Western medicine is designed to do. It's supposed to isolate the problem, identify it, and provide treatment for it. So, so, and that's very different from the world of memorizing facts and figures and regurgitating them on an exam. And my sense is that it's going to need constant energy to try to evaluate what is the most vital and essential components of the things that you're learning, and to connect it to your actual experience in the clinical setting, and to constantly be making those connections and having repeated exposure to those concepts. So I think the clinical experience is a big part of it, and really, even when you're learning in a didactic manner, identifying the 20% of the information that's going to have 80% of the yield. So yeah, so I think that's how studying in pre-clerkship, that's what it should focus on.
Right.
And it depends too on your own goals too, as like what kind of specialty you want to enter, or maybe you have a particular research interest or other things. So that can vary, but I think the common traits that make a good clerk and a good general physician are all relatively similar.
It's fascinating because I've been trying to juggle two ideas at the same time, and you touched on one of them, which is essentially prioritization. It's prioritizing the information that you think is going to be valuable and important. And to be honest, if there's, I don't know how many medical students there are, let's say like 1,200 that enter first year in all of Canada or whatever. Those 1,200 medical students will have different experiences, every single one, and they'll remember different pieces of information, and that's fine, right? Like we could all learn maybe like 20%, like you said, and we can collectively cover all the information that's out there and provide adequate care that way. So that's one thing that I'm juggling, is prioritizing important information. But then the other thing is, when I talk to physicians or when I see actual clinical situations, so I've done one observership so far, it's so different. It's so like details become amazingly important. Like they need to know exact numbers. They need to know down to the point exactly what is going on with the patient. Otherwise, those details are what allow for them to do differential diagnoses and eventually provide the best possible care. And so I'm trying to figure out, where is the line between prioritizing important information and also knowing enough detail to be a competent physician. And that's not something that I think is being talked about anymore. There's so much conversation nowadays about seeing the patient as a whole and being more compassionate, more empathetic, delivering holistic care. But now there is so little talk about being a competent physician who is able to take medically relevant information and details to offer the best possible care. And so I'm still trying to work with that. And yeah.
Well, I don't think those two things are incompatible with each other. So the first thing is about identifying important clinically relevant information. And the other thing you mentioned was kind of the medically detail oriented, like there's situations where those values and those specifics get incredibly important. Again, depending on the specialty. So there's a whole feedback process between, so here's what I originally think is important when I'm studying, and like I don't have any idea of what the clinical reality is like. And then you go and see that, oh, maybe like half of the stuff I've been focusing on, like that's actually useless. And the details that I thought were going to be useless, oh no, they're actually really important. I better go like recalibrate my sense of what's going to be important. So I think it's a constant feedback process of getting clinical exposure, and it's complicated by the fact that different specialties have different characteristics, different kind of information that will help make a differential diagnosis or provide treatment. So that's what makes it so complex, and you constantly have to I don't know, give yourself feedback and evaluate what's working, what's not, what's most important, what's not. And that's a crazy process to try to juggle. And that's, I think, a part of the reason why medicine has such a steep learning curve.
Right.
And, I think about the fact that most of the practitioners that you see in like major hospitals, they're real specialists in their field, and they've been doing what they've done for maybe 10, 20, even 30 years. So they have that wealth of knowledge and experience that a medical student is not going to, reach, or they have a level of competence that the standard medical student is not going to reach at all. It is going to fall way short of. So all of these things make it a uphill battle, but still, I think the process can be made easier if we're more attentive to what is actually useful, or at least what we think is useful, going out in the world, seeing what works, doesn't work, and coming back and kind of tweaking the way you learn.
So, the importance of being humble. And well, it's difficult, right? So we talk about this a lot. It's the chaos and order, right? It's the border between chaos and order, and you're constantly sitting there because you have an idea, you have a preconception, then you go out and you test it, it gets proven wrong, and then you have to come back and reorganize your thoughts, and that's such a tiring process, right? It's a marathon, so it's definitely important to pace yourself and go slow, so you don't run out of energy, right?
Oh, I appreciate these transitions, but I do think they can be forced.
Well, no, I think it's important, honestly. I think burnout, one of the things that medical students actually burn out with is because of failure, right? And for example, like failure to match to a residency, a part of that is you got something wrong. Like you thought you were prepared, you did all these things, you thought that what you knew was useful and was practical, and you learn, the world teaches you that it's wrong. And if you can't bounce back from that with resilience, then you're going to burn out. You're going to be so you're not going to trust yourself anymore, right?
what can you trust after an experience like that? After
Mm,
maybe the strategy that's been working for you for the past 25 years comes to you at least and seems like collapsing down
mm,
because of one seemingly catastrophic failure.
mhm.
What's really interesting is I was at a talk about mental health for medical students, and it was given by a psychiatrist at Mac, and I thought it wasn't the most like insightful presentation,
Okay.
but one of the things that the presenter said that struck me was, so I asked her a question, and the question was, do you see any common patterns in the medical students who come to visit you about like burnout or mental health issues? And she said, I'm paraphrasing, but the number one thing about most of the medical students that she sees with mental health concerns, the most evident trait is perfectionism.
Mm.
And like if you think about that in another way, you can say the something like the number one predictor of mental health concerns is perfectionism. You know,
Right.
like what does that mean? Because you know, for all I know, like it seems like everyone is striving to be perfect or to be without flaw, to be kind of secure, and everyone knows what they're striving for.
Mhm.
They're working for perfection because they like to feel stable. They you know don't like to fail. They
Mhm.
don't like the place they end up in when they fail, and me included. So like that got me thinking a lot about, well, then if we don't aim for perfect every time, then what do we aim for?
Mm.
And my answer was something like good enough. And the thing is, can you be satisfied with good enough? Or are you comfortable going slower, uh, acknowledging failures, and kind of being broken down at times because of your failures or your inadequacies, but maybe that's a better long-term strategy for better learning, for better mental health, just for general satisfaction in life.
Well, let's answer that question right now.
Yeah.
Do you have an answer?
What was the question I posed?
The question is, are you okay with just doing good enough? Um, I have an answer immediately, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Let's hear your answer.
well, the answer is never put all your eggs in one basket. And
Uh-huh.
so when it comes to medicine, the tricky part is that people's lives can be at stake. So it's hard to say, okay, we can just be good enough. But I mean, we're human beings too. But the idea that I have is, oh look, you shouldn't ride your whole self-esteem and your entire life on just medicine. There's so many other things you could be doing, and I think you should be doing, and that you should be putting value in, like family, friends, your hobbies, even, and other things that keep you well. So I think, um, as a human being, I'd say, okay, yes, good enough is honestly good enough. And then you see people who are in the medical field and who, like for example, surgeons who are doing cardiac surgery. I'm sure a lot of them would never think good enough is satisfactory, and those are exceptional people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And these are exceptional people who often give up other things in order for them to be so perfect in the one thing, in the one field that they dedicate themselves to.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it comes to a matter of what you value. And for me personally, I value a lot of other things in my life that I think are prioritized over just medicine. And so me personally, I would take that responsibility and I would say, okay, maybe I won't be a cardiac surgeon, or I won't be someone who needs to be dependable 100% of the time. I know that, I we shouldn't perpetuate the culture that people should be dependable 100% of the time. But there are people who are comfortable with that and who in fact would take that up, and that's what they value. And so why stop them, right?
Right.
But personally, I think I know what my limits are and what I value, and so that would be my answer.
Yeah, I think that touches on a lot of really important points. So I guess people have different expectations for what good enough is. And so taking the example of a cardiac surgeon or a neurosurgeon,
Mm,
when your expectations is that like a very small error can have very catastrophic consequences in the operating room, your definition of good needs to get to
mm,
99.99%. And like you said, I think there are people whose interests and motivations and values line up such that living that kind of life fulfills them, and it creates meaning and interest and a whole host of other things for them.
mm,
I think when I try to think about the concept of good enough for myself, I don't think I'm one of those people who can derive like a lot of pleasure by indulging in one very specific thing.
mm,
I I think I have a whole host of varying and very diverse interests,
mhm,
very diverse in terms of the people and the things I value. So, how can you be good enough for for everything?
mm,
So if I really valued my career, and that was the thing I valued above, above all else, then maybe just dedicating myself to be really good at that thing um, will be enough, and I don't have to be good
mm,
for my family. I don't have to be all these other things. So I don't know. I'm kind of losing my train of thought, but
mm. I, I
yeah.
also want to mention that it's a continual process too, right? Values change over time.
Hmm.
Um, and so right now we might be like, oh yeah, we're never going to be neurosurgeons, we're never going to be cardiac surgeons, and you never know. Like 10 years down the line, that might be the only thing that is fulfilling to us. Um, you don't know, but right now, I mean, you and I are similar in that way that we have these diverse interests, and we want to, get around a bit and see the world and experience other things without focusing too much on just our career. Um, so yeah, so for now on, I think as long as we keep doing what we think is valuable and important, we'll be all right.
Hmm.
And that's something I learned from you. So
I hope so too. I think so too.
yeah.
Well, when I was talking about that, I explained like kind of all there's this conflict between values, the things I value and the things I
Hmm.
want, and that's a constant internal struggle for everyone, I assume. Um, so this week we had a session on mindfulness, and it was a classic Parmjeet talk lecture about mindfulness and the brain, followed by a group discussion on mindfulness and the value of meditation slash mindfulness. And I've been exposed to this talk many times about the scientific benefits of meditation and mindfulness.
Mm,
But that day, for some reason, I really started to appreciate the value of it, because it occurred to me that one of the things that I like to do with mindfulness is to try to listen to the different aspects of my psyche. So it's something like I think a lot of meditation practices focus on kind of stilling your mind, being silent, being
mm,
at peace. um, and to kind of, brush off the kind of random thoughts and, that your monkey brain is generating. Don't listen to those. And that's never been a satisfactory model for me, because there are so many things that like my monkey brain is generating, and sometimes they're of value. Sometimes they say really interesting things. So kind of my conception of the mind, or or our brain is, so it's a multi-layered structure. So we have our lower brain, our brain stem, the kind of very basic brain that helps with our autonomous functions, our heartbeat, our respiration, our locomotion. And then there's the more kind of emotional, reactive part of our brain, the limbic system. And that regulates, as we've learned, things like lust, sexual desire, the need to reproduce, and also a tribal in-group, out-group identification, quick threat detection, and another variety of emotional responses. And then we have our neocortex, and we've had the discussion about the different aspects of the left and right brain. And so it seems as though that we have a like kind of interconnected but still autonomous circuits, all kind of working together at times, inhibiting each other at times, and like really conflicting with one another at times. And I think the proper way to conceptualize that is as something like separate but also kind of fused personalities, different persons fighting against one another, um, all fighting against one another, to kind of take control of the person, so that they can manipulate the person's behaviors to that brain personality's desire. Let's, so that's how I conceptualize the mind. And I think there are often times that, so let's say our rational selves, our cortical selves, its main function is inhibitory. So it can inhibit the lizard brain and the brainstem, and kind of hold off on its demands or its impulses, delay gratification, and steer in different ways. But I think connecting back to perfectionism, and with constant expectations of success and achieving to a higher degree, we often neglect and don't listen to and silence those lower needs, or the different kind of personalities that are residing within us. And so I think it was Wednesday night after the mindfulness session had ended, and I came home after a pretty long day, and I just sat down on the couch, just staring at the wall. And I was probably lying there for something like 20 minutes, just kind of listening to what my brain was generating. And if I could give it a voice, or give the words to the feelings, I think it said something like June, I'm exhausted. You got to give me some time to rest. I'm glad you're doing that now. I never feel heard. And just by listening to that, it kind of dissolved that inner complaint. Or another one that pops up is like anger and frustration. So I mentioned to you like cleanliness problems with my roommates. And so every time I see that, I know that a part of me is like reacts to that, is like irked by that, and has a unclean anger response in my territory kind of response to that. But every time I'm like, okay, I have more important priorities. I'll take care of it later. I'll talk to my roommate later. But it kept getting like silence, and so that kind of voice constantly grows, and each time it manifests itself, it comes out a little stronger, stronger than I expected. So I think it's important to kind of give your mind the space to open up this dialogue. something else I felt too is that, like, so if you're in a group, like, usually have, that one very quiet person that's kind of looking around, observing, but like they're kind of shy and they don't really want to say anything. I felt that there's like an equivalent of that in my psyche. And if I
Interesting.
still it, and
Mm,
if I'm attentive to it, and the kind of wisdom or information that it can give me,
mm,
um, then it'll finally feel comfortable enough to open up, because it knows that it's being heard, or that it is being attended to.
mm,
So I thought, and I'm going to try to practice this more. I think it's important to give space, for you to experience emotion, to evaluate them, and when you don't get the chance to talk to them, or right away, then maybe at the end of the day, giving 20, 30 minutes for that internal dialogue to arise. And maybe when all the kinks that you've been ignoring have been kind of sorted out in your own mind,
mm.
then maybe you can meditate in peace.
Very interesting. Very cool.
Uh,
Hmm. I want to touch upon that too, because so my monkey brain, my lizard brain speaks in Korean because that's the language I learned when I was young. No, honest. So whenever I get mad or like very disturbed by something, I just swear in Korean and it makes me feel so good. It's very interesting. I don't know. You can try it.
yeah.
It's like a separate voice. And today, actually, just now, I had a very visceral, angry moment where, so my mom and I went to pick up some food from Burger King, and the the server, or the person at the front, um, mixed up our order with the person behind us.
Yeah.
So we saw the bag. We're like, oh, this isn't our order. So we bring it back, and I talked to the guy who was behind us, saying, "Oh, yo, this is your food," and he doesn't say anything. He just looks at the server, and the server takes the food, and she's like, "Do you want me to get a new one?" And he's like, "Yeah." Like, and then I look at him like, "Yo, I didn't even touch it. Like, I didn't touch the food. Why aren't you taking it?" And he says nothing. And then my mom and I, like, we just leave with our food. So I'm thinking, is this guy like racist, or is this guy like so germophobic or whatever that he won't take the food that I barely touched, I just grabbed by the bag? And throughout, like, the drive back, I'm thinking to myself, and I'm like super angry, and I'm imagining all these different scenarios where I would have like attacked him, or like verbally, like I said something to him, and like all of this. And then I get home, and before I enter the door, I'm like, I just swear in Korean. I'm like, and then I go in, and I'm fine. I walk in and I'm fine. I decided I'm not gonna enter my house angry, so I let my Korean out, and then I walked in, and everything was okay again. So it's very interesting how, um, you know, the voice that you have in your head, it's like a totally separate entity. It's like a child that's that's grown up but hasn't followed with you through the years. There's
Yeah.
there's an interesting fact that I learned, actually, like a week ago or something. Your limbic system develops very rapidly, and by like 12, 13 years of age, like, it's almost fully developed. But
Mhm.
your prefrontal cortex and your more executive functions don't develop fully until you're 25, 26. That's why adolescents are. Sorry.
For males, and for females, that develops a little bit quicker,
Mm.
which is interesting to note. I think there's a lot of comments about men generally tending to be a little more immature,
Right.
impulsive, especially when they're young, and
Mm.
maybe an artifact of that.
I think so. I think so.
Yeah.
Um, and so obviously, I'm 22. It hasn't My prefrontal cortex hasn't fully developed yet, so I'm not the best at pressing down my anger, or my emotional, visceral reactions. But I am learning, um,
Yeah.
and I think exercises like this help. definitely.
I I think like, so here's the thought that I've been having. So
Mm.
when you learn to drive a car, like you're given lessons. You can search up the instruction manual for how a car works.
Mm.
You get driving lessons with your, parents, and they point out like kind of your flaws, and then like you learn to fix it over time, and you become a functional driver. Um, and and that's a machine like a car, but take a like organism kind of machine that is 1,000 times that in its complexity, maybe 1,000,000 times.
Mm-hmm.
Did you know that the number of connections like in throughout your nervous system is more than the amount of atoms in the universe?
Wow.
Like that is like I really want to double check the calculation,
Yeah.
but I have
Who
seen
did
it
the
from multiple
calculation?
sources, and it does seem to be true. And I mean that just demonstrates the degree of complexity, that of the kind of body we're operating in. And it's
Mhm.
ridiculous because there are no instruction manuals, and like to some degree we learn how to use it as we grow up. We get some advice from our parents,
Mm.
but no one really knows how to use it. It's like we're born in this like amazing technology or biological something, but we have no idea how to operate it.
Mm.
It's so damn difficult. Um, and not only operate it for yourself, but operate it like between other people. So it's like an incredibly difficult task that we're trying to accomplish.
Mm.
But I think or one of the tricks that helps, or one of the facts of knowledge that can help, is that you, like the cortical, rational, thinking you, the you that speaks and can uh, and see the future and is wise, that part of you can talk and negotiate with the other parts of you. So so I thought about that anger response too, because I've noticed it more recently. It's been getting stronger than I felt before.
Wow.
Well, it's
Wait.
more it's more what it's coming up to the surface and
Mm.
manifesting in my like facial expressions or
Mhm.
mood, more often. And I've struggled with, well, like how do I contend with this? And the thing to note, I think, is that this is like a very generalized system, right? And so it's very prone to errors, but when it's right,
Mm.
it can be really right, and it can generate the kind of force necessary to take down a predator or a threat, and you need that intense activation at times.
Right.
Like most of the time, that's not going to be it's going to be maladaptive, especially in today's day and age, where we're pretty safe. So if I try to like apply that to like my day-to-day life, so I go downstairs and I see garbage in the kitchen, and then like my anger at like threat detection territorial system kind of engages and kind of growls like, I don't like that. And then I think the job of like you in the driver's seat as that wise person on the top of your head, I think their job is to say, okay, I acknowledge you. I understand why those concerns may have manifested.
Mm.
Okay, let's see if that is a valid concern. So in the case of like the Burger King example, I might conclude after some like deliberation that, okay, I literally do not have enough data to make a reasonable and sufficient conclusion. So in this case, I'm going to inhibit your anger activity, or let it kind of come out without any harm to anyone else.
Right.
in the case that I see garbage on my like on my kitchen, I say to the anger response, like, maybe I'll give it a name. Maybe I'll like name it Simba or something. Like,
The lion.
yeah, the lion. Like, hey Simba, like, you know what? You're kind of right. You do have a reason to be sort of mad. Um, you it'd be nice to have a clean kitchen where you can work and cook in peace and with lots of space.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I think a reasonable step would be to bring this issue up with your roommate. So I'm going to acknowledge your anger, and I'm going to borrow a little bit of it to act. And so I think there can be this negotiated, more harmonious relationship
Mm.
between your higher self and your kind of lower selves. And maybe when the lower selves feel that, hey, this guy at the top, like, he's pretty smart. He's like, it's a pretty cool dude. I can trust them. Then maybe they come into more of an alignment
Mm.
in your psyche. And I think that process is fascinating because I think for most of my life I haven't been doing that. I have maybe in high school I've always just learned to suppress those urges that I was having and just to study, but like that can't go on forever
Mm-hmm.
because I think one of the things that's been changing in me is that like those forces and those like waves of emotion have been getting more intense and stronger. And maybe that's part of like the suppression they've endured. And maybe that's also part of my like biological growth and like continuing growth. There was a line in, his name is Hermann Hesse. He's a great German author. And I don't remember the exact lines, but he wrote a book that we read in one class, and it's called Beneath the Wheel. It kind of tells a story of this really awkward prepubescent boy that's been growing up in a very suppressed environment, kind of forced to study, very similar to us in some ways. But the author, regarding his kind of like pubescent pre-adulthood period, he describes the boy's situation as he was on this flimsy sailboat that he didn't know how to navigate. And little did he know that like a huge flood, like a tsunami level flood of like his psyche and emotions were about to hit that fragile little ship. Right. I think there's like in our development, so something about our psyche kind of like exponentially grows in strength and expression and intensity. And if you don't know how to contend with that or to ride the waves or stay afloat, then you might get shipwrecked. And eventually the boy was crushed beneath the wheel. The wheel represents the pressures of the constant pressures and cycles of life. And the boy eventually commits suicide in the end, because of kind of all those expectations and other things that happened to him and his emotions. But I think the better we can get our higher selves at riding those waves and negotiating to the sea spirit that's causing those waves, the more we can master our psyches and integrate ourselves.
I want to comment on the. Oh, it's weird. I can hear myself through your mic again. I want to comment on the feeling that you're getting, that you're becoming more, I guess, emotional, or these emotional states are becoming more intense, and you're experiencing them more intensely. I've been feeling the same way, and like I've cried more in the last like 2 years than I have in like the last 10 years of my life before that.
Mm-hmm.
And what I noticed is a part of that is because I have more connections in my brain.
Mm.
And so when I experience something, all of a sudden that is connected to a lot of different memories at the same time. And now those visceral emotional reactions that I got from those memories are now connected to this one. And it's all compounded, and I feel it all at once.
It's like a chain reaction that gets set off.
Yeah, yeah. So like for example, with the Burger King guy, he reminded me of someone who ticked me off like a few years ago.
Yeah.
And there were like features of him that reminded me of that other person who was very dismissive towards me and you know wouldn't talk to me eye to eye. And so I felt that level of frustration. And I think this is why maybe like older people tend to have more prejudices or like
Yeah.
preconceptions, is because they have a more complex network of these memories that compound and, as you said, like create that big tidal wave, that flood that can sink the ship. So in defense of that, I think it's important to maybe work through our experiences as they come and make sure they don't compound. Make sure that when we have those sort of visceral reactions, we know how to process them and compartmentalize them so that okay, maybe they won't be triggered the next time you have a similar incident. Or when you have a similar incident, you can remember you processing that and resolving that instead of just the visceral emotions. I think that's probably the basis of like psychotherapy, right? Unresolved tensions in your mind, you have to work through them and make sure you're clear on what you should be doing as a result of that and how you should be managing your emotions.
Yeah, no, I think you hit on a really important point, because those networks of associations get really encoded and associated with one another.
Mm-hmm.
And with repeated exposure, you have more like the experience you described. Like I can think of instances like that where it's just even the tone of someone's voice reminds me of a hurtful experience I had. And so those uh, web of associations,
Mm.
that neuronal tangle web of associations just kind of floods me. So I think you're right. Like in psychotherapy, something that's really important is to kind of examine those associations, like really look closely at, are they valid? Are they useful? Are they true?
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of have to like it's a difficult process of kind of like dissecting where you went wrong, and you know, this association is not quite right, and this habit like you could you know, do less with. And um, I I don't think we've been practicing that as a
Mm.
species, maybe. Um, well, it's so hard to do, and it's so maybe against our own lower natures.
Yeah.
And I think your observation about older people holding those prejudices, I think that's right, because imagine that like you form those networks of connections over time, compounding, and the thing is that once you have a sufficient number of connections, that becomes like rigid, um,
Mm.
and very difficult to change. And I like that's a property of all systems, and the way that you kind of revivify that is to give it a chance to dissociate, to and to bring back psychedelics into the conversation. I think that's one area where that can be like really intensely helpful. So like PTSD is often treated with MDMA psychotherapy. One
Mm.
of the functions of MDMA is that it inhibits your cingulate cortex. And your cingulate cortex is something like it's a web of networks distributed across the brain, that, um, let's say, it's like a highway for associations to form between the different lobes and parts of your brain.
Mm.
So that kind of maintains the normal range of interpretations and associations that your brain holds. So when MDMA inhibits that, your kind of previously held associations are kind of temporarily suspended, and then that rigid network is suspended, and your brain forms new networks and associations in order
Mm.
to compensate for that.
Right.
And you know, that doesn't only occur through psychedelics or like something that I hoping to get involved in with the research, like cannabis, for example.
Mm.
But it can also happen through a process of conscious observation, and very very careful steps, you know, each part of your life, because one thing I also noticed with social media is that when I make those associations, the first things that come up are images and then emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And it happens so fast. And if we feed ourselves like that kind of images, those kind of images, like scrolling through Facebook, Instagram, we may not know it, but we're forming all these associations and emotional baggage that I think are hindering us from our full potential, our full neuronal potential.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's all to say. Like this has been a fascinating discussion so far, but it's all to say that learning how to operate your brain
Mm-hmm.
and your body is one of the most difficult tasks ever, but
Yes.
one of the most important things that we can do.
Mm-hmm. Maybe that's a good place to end it. That was riveting. I really enjoyed that. I think we're both very much interested in our brain. We might actually end up being neurosurgeons in the future. Who knows? Um, but we'll get there week by week. So we'll be back next week to talk about our experiences. So thank you all for listening.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Bye bye. Happy Canadian Thanksgiving. Bye.